SMU political science professor Matthew Wilson, thank you so much and welcome back to Ion Politics.
Well, thanks for having me.
You bet. So, Congressman Jasmine Crockett said that she's going to be making her decision this week about whether she's going to run for U.S. Senate. And while we may not know that publicly, what her answer is, if she does get into the Senate race, the Democratic primary, what impact do you think that would have on the primary?
Well, all polling suggests she would be very competitive in the Democratic primary, that she would be a major contender for the Democratic nomination. And she certainly has a devoted following, not only in Texas, but nationally. So I think she would be able to raise a decent amount of money to make a bid for that nomination. Certainly, I think Colin Allred, James Tallarico would prefer to see her not get into the race. That's something that they would have to reckon with her as a formidable contender. But of course, the calculus for her is not really about winning the Democratic primary. It's if she were to win the Democratic nomination, how credible would her chances be in the general election? And that's perhaps a different story.
Yes, and before we get to that, because I do want to ask you about that, with regards to a Democratic primary, I mean, she told me last week that she believes that that wouldn't be an issue, the Democratic primary. She told me she's not even polling for that. But I'm wondering if she does decide to do it. You know, Tallarico has certainly gotten a lot of attention, a lot of good national press. You have former Congressman Allred, who's still out there, who's done this now once and knows the pitfalls, et cetera. And both of them raise money, and I'm sure Congresswoman Crockett would still be able to raise a lot of money because she's done so in her congressional seat. But I'm wondering, as far as now competing on a statewide level and running a campaign and, spending the money and then raising the money, where do you think that all lands if she gets in?
Well, first of all, I wouldn't, if I were her, take it for granted that she would win the Democratic primary. I mean, certainly she's going to be a viable contender, but there are other viable contenders who have already thrown their hats in the ring. And Colin Allred has experience running a statewide campaign. That's something that Congresswoman Crockett does not have. Also, both Allred and Tallarico, I think, would press very vigorously electability arguments against Jasmine Crockett. I think their arguments would be that they have a better chance of actually winning the seat for the Democrats than does Congresswoman Crockett. So I wouldn't take it as a foregone conclusion that she would win the Democratic primary if she gets in, although she would be a very strong and formidable contender. Now, with regard to fundraising, I think she can draw on some national networks of people who have been really energized, some Democratic and left-leaning activists who have been really energized by her combative style in Washington, her taking on President Trump, her taking on Republican figures like Marjorie Taylor Greene. These are things that have really excited the Democratic online base, and I think it would make it quite possible for her to raise money from a pretty broad network of national donors. So, bottom line, if she chooses to get in the race, I fully expect that she will have the funds that she needs to prosecute a credible campaign.
And do you think that this is a case where Democrats, they want a fighter. They want somebody to really take it to the Trump administration, the president himself, as she has done, certainly more so than the two candidates who are already in the Senate race.
Well, I think that's what she would be banking on. And I think that is her appeal. That is, there are a lot of people in the Democratic base who are just deeply, deeply angry about everything associated with the Trump administration and who want to see Democrats pushing back hard and being extremely combative. And of course, that's Jasmine Crockett to a T. I think, in fact, we see this in both political parties that the bases want combative candidates. They want people who will mix it up with the other side. The era of more courtly, genteel politics seems to be out the window. And I think that's what John Cornyn is struggling with on the Republican side. And I think that's what someone like Colin Allred or James Tallarico would struggle with in going up against Jasmine Crockett on the Democratic side.
And so let's talk about the fact that here, if she does get in, there would be three major Democratic candidates. And what does that say about the Democratic Party in Texas? Or is this a case where all three of them were only doing this because they think that Ken Paxton is going to win the Republican primary and they smell political blood?
Well, the perception of opportunity is absolutely important in driving this. And the opportunity perception comes from two things. First of all, the fact that President Trump has had a rocky tenure, that Republicans in special elections have done pretty poorly, and that Democrats say, maybe 2026 could be a really bad Republican year nationally and could open up possibilities in places like Texas where Democrats are not normally competitive. Now, you combine that national environment with Ken Paxton's personal baggage and their perception that he's got a good chance of taking the Republican nomination. And they say, look, you combine the ability to run against Trump and run against Paxton, there may be an open door for a Democratic victory here. So I think that's why you are seeing relatively prominent, credible Democratic figures wanting to throw their hats in the ring.
So the other thing that Congresswoman Crockett told me last week is that her internal polling, she said she would only get into a race if the polling shows that she could expand the electorate and that she could win a general election based on that expanded electorate. So what do you think? I mean, do you think that she has the ability to expand the electorate and win a general?
Well, Democrats in Texas have been talking about expanding the electorate for cycle after cycle after cycle. What that used to mean was getting Hispanic voters to show up at the polls. However, Hispanic voters in Texas have actually been trending more Republican in recent cycles. So that put a dent in that whole strategy. Now, whether that will continue in 2026, we'll see. But what Congresswoman Crockett must mean by that is that she believes she can reach out to disengaged younger voters, perhaps a larger share of the African American electorate, to grow the base of the Democratic Party. And with what we've seen with somewhat a lackluster Republican turnout, in some of the recent races, it is possible that the electorate in 2026 in Texas will look more Democratic than it typically does. And if Congresswoman Crockett thinks that that's going to be the case, she may feel like she has a plausible enough chance to throw her hat in the ring.
Well, I mean, she said that she's not talking about bringing Republicans over to the Democratic side. She
Mhm.
said she would need people to attract people who have not voted and bring them into the fold. I get, she said Trump did that, and she said
Mhm.
Obama did that.
Yeah, that's right. That would have to be the strategy because if you're looking for crossover appeal or someone who really clicks with independent or moderate voters, Crockett would not be the way to go. That's not going to be her strategy. That is, either Tallarico or Allred would presumably have more appeal to the center of the electorate. Crockett's strategy would be different. Hers would be a fire up the base strategy. And coupling that with trying to bring to the polls people who in the past have not participated. Now, that's always a hard way to go. But President Trump did have a fair bit of success with that and outperformed expectations because he did get some low propensity voters to show up. It's easier to do in a presidential cycle than in a midterm, but it's at least within the realm of possibility.
Now, Congresswoman Crockett said that she would share her internal polling with former Congressman Allred and with State Representative Tallarico. And if she decides not to get into this race, what does that say about their ability to win? If she said that she wouldn't get in if she couldn't expand the electorate, um, if you're the Tallarico campaign or the Allred campaign, are you looking at like, oh boy, that's not a good thing for us? What do you say to that?
Well, it certainly wouldn't be a good sign. It would send a signal that Crockett at least perceives it to be very much an uphill battle for a Democratic candidate in this race. Now, I think what Allred and Tellerico would say is they have more crossover appeal than Jasmine Crockett does. So they may think that they could outperform her among moderate voters, independent voters, etc. Whether they would have as much success as she would in firing up the Democratic base is the other side of that coin. And so, there are a lot of different moving parts in this equation. But if she decides not to get in the race, I think that does send the signal that despite Ken Paxton's baggage, despite the likely rough climate for Republicans nationally, that she still perceives the Texas Senate seat as Republicans to lose.
And let's talk about the Republicans. We have not seen a lot of independent polling. We've seen a lot of internal polling since
Mhm.
Congressman Wesley Hunt got into the Republican primary for U.S. Senate, but not a lot of truly independent polling. And so, how do you look at this race at this point?
Well, first of all, I would say we need to take internal polls that are released to the media with a grain of salt because those are very often done to drive an agenda and to support talking points that the various candidates have. Uh, that said, the public polling has seemed to show John Cornyn pulling pretty much even with Ken Paxton. However, in recent weeks, there's been more fire trained on John Cornyn, so he doesn't have the airwaves to himself anymore, and that may have seen some erosion in his position. Wesley Hunt's entry into the race is a real wild card. It's not clear exactly how that cuts. Of course, Hunt's argument is that he has a better chance to win over conservatives than does John Cornyn, and that he brings a cleaner slate and much less baggage and negatives to the race than does Ken Paxton. And there's a decent amount of polling data to support those things. Whether he can overcome the greater name recognition that Cornyn and Paxton have is still an open question. But in the absence of credible statewide independent polling in recent weeks, it's hard to say exactly where this race stands.
And, aside from these internal polls, helping them with their messaging, I think they are also trying to attract President Trump's endorsement, obviously. We've been talking about that for months already. And so I'm wondering, after a while, does the president just say, all right, I'm staying out of this and see what happens?
Yeah, I mean, I think that President Trump will be reluctant to make an endorsement under conditions of uncertainty. One of the things we've seen nationally is that President Trump is very, very loath to end up backing a losing horse. And if he wades in on behalf of someone who may end up losing, that risks a black eye and the sense that his clout and influence is diminished. And that's something he's very sensitive to right now. So I think until and unless someone starts to clearly pull away, I would be surprised if President Trump put his thumb on the scale.
And we're probably not going to know that for months, right? I mean, for maybe mid-February, right? Isn't that
Yeah, it
fair?
will definitely be into the new year before I think we start to get a real handle on where the race stands.
And last question, and I know the supporters of John Cornyn and Senator Cornyn himself have been making the case to President Trump that, look, I can protect people down ballot, Paxton can't, and if I'm not the standard bearer, then the Republicans are going to have to spend a lot of money defending this seat, money that could be used for open Senate seats that the Republicans could be facing in Michigan and elsewhere. And what do you say to that argument?
Well, I think it certainly carries a lot of weight vis-a-vis Ken Paxton. The issue is, though, that if Wesley Hunt is viewed as a credible alternative, that argument doesn't really work vis-a-vis him because Hunt can say, look, I can appeal to conservatives in the base, but I also am not going to be a problem reputationally, nationally, or within the state the way that Ken Paxton would be. So at least the talking points for the Hunt campaign is that they're the best of both worlds. So that that argument that Cornyn was making and is making got at least a little more complicated once it was a three-candidate race rather than a two-candidate race.
SMU political science professor Matthew Wilson, thank you as always. We appreciate it.
All right. Thank you for having me.